Good afternoon, students. As you've figured out, I'm not here this afternoon. I'm on a training course trying to be an even better teacher. I hope you'll extend your respect to Chris, who's looking after you. Our objectives for today are to improve your marks on your formal assessment through adding, refining or replacing what you did. Plan and self-assess some exam questions from a paper 1, which was last summer's paper 1. Review your previous formal assessments. If you manage to get all of that done, read an article from the Economic Review, if you manage to get all of that done. And lastly, at the end of the lesson is Guru Alex's revision class, so stay for that. And I'll also tell you how you can get some extra feedback in that session as well. Little reminders, the memorised topics are still there to keep practicing, so practice, practice, practice. Get those definitions perfect. The essay for next Tuesday will be on Moodle. Have a go at those multiple choice self-assessments to improve your multiple choice skills. Okay, key thing about the exam is remember it's in 30-minute chunks. So your exam in terms of quarters will each be 30 minutes. So you should keep an eye on how far you're getting. The FA4 that we just did had 3 questions which would take up 30 minutes, and then the choice question which would take another 30. Just when you do your homeworks, still try to stick to those 30 minutes. We're over kind of halfway now with our practice on the homeworks, but you should put aside 30 minutes for that to get better and doing more and more in those 30 minutes. When it comes to the homework, when there is a video, try and watch it after you've planned the questions yourself. So take a little bit of time after you've planned the questions and then use it to check your own knowledge. And also watch it after you've read the case study. So we have to start kind of transitioning away from relying on the videos to answer the questions and move more towards checking your own answers and getting better and better at that skill. Okay, so I said we'd go through the formal assessment 4. The first question on formal assessment 4 said with reference to figure 2, which was this figure here, describe what happened to income inequality in Russia. Illustrate your answer with a Lorenz curve diagram. The other graph that was at the start, which was figure 1, was showing the average growth rate for the G7 developed countries and the average growth rate for Russia from 1998 to 2012. And as it's an index, you can say that Russia's economy has effectively grown by 100% during that period, whereas the average for the G7 was only 20%. There is a significant dip here around the global recession, but then the economy after that picked up and continued to grow. So there is some evidence that the Russian economy is doing well from that part of the case study. What we have to be very careful of is in this diagram there are 2 different measurements here. There is relative poverty, and it gives you the definition for relative poverty here, but there is also inequality, and the one that's showing inequality is this line, which is showing the Gini coefficient. Even though it does improve slightly towards the end, what you are looking for is the overall trend. So the overall trend is that it has gone from about 0.45 or 0.045 to 0.41, sorry, to 0.425. Now as it's increased, and remember 0 is what we want it to be, it's becoming more unequal. Now some of us looking at that data saw relative poverty, and even though relative poverty can be linked to inequality, what this graph is showing is a situation where it's not. So actually there is a decrease in relative poverty, and a lot of us analysed that and said that inequality was falling. In the absence of this Gini information, that is something that might be happening, but because you have the Gini information showing an actual increase in the Gini over the time, then it's showing that inequality is getting worse. Now, the other thing that we needed to show was the Lorenz curve, and a lot of us forgot what the axes were. So it is 0 to 100% of the incomes and cumulative income, or 0 to 100% of the population. And the line of equality, if we drew it, it would have been better if we had a label. Then you've got the start of, say, 1999, or whichever point you want to start on, so we'll put 1999 here, and to show it getting worse, we want the curve to go further away from equality, and then that would be potentially 2011. We have to state somewhere in the question, so we've got our application there, we've drawn our graph, but by just stating that there is an increase in inequality, that's going to be a key mark as well. So drawing the graph, showing the change in the 2 years, the line of equality, the axis are key. We've got the figure there, and then we've also specifically said that there is an increase in inequality. Okay, the next question was an assess question, so we know that we've got two sides here. The implications, so in other words, thinking of impacts on the Russian economy, for the Russian economy, of its dependence on oil and gas. Now, there was an approach to this question that a lot of people did this in terms of scarce resources. However, what you also have is some information on Russia's trade balance. So they've given you that because they want you to kind of try and use that where possible. And as you can see, the trade balance of Russia in terms of this is in terms of monetary terms billion, so that's positive, and that would mean that they were always in a surplus. However, they can go from a surplus of 50 billion to a surplus of nearly 10 billion as the oil price fell in the recession. Then, sorry, that one. Then it spikes straight back up to nearly 50 billion, but then it can also fall again by about 15 billion. Then it goes back up again by 20 billion. Then it falls by about 5 billion. Then it goes up by about 15 billion. So you do have some key things here about the volatility that primary products has within the economy. You've got a lot of information here in the case study that's really relevant, and some of us use this quite well, but a lot of this is the positives, or why primary independence is good. So oil and gas, and if you can see in the graph that the trade balance follows quite closely to the price of oil. So there's a significant increase in the price of oil there between 2007 and 2008, and between 2009 and 2013, again the price of oil is rising. So there's evidence there of the benefits, and it talks about some of the benefits here as well. There's been an increase in incomes, there's been a fall in unemployment, they have now 500 billion of foreign currency reserves, which is a lack of currency reserves holds back development. It's talking about the growth staying at 4% for the next few years. So you've got a lot of evidence that actually that's not bad for the economy, but it's because of the rising demand for oil. So what you do have is in the market for oil, the increase in demand is increasing the volume that they sell, but it's also increasing the value because the price of oil is rising. So this is kind of the argument that primary dependency is good. Now, what we have to be careful though is some of us made the argument that that's because of inelastic demand. The inelastic demand means that demand doesn't change very much. So that in itself doesn't tell you why primary dependence is a good thing. What it does tell you is as the price rises, so you have to specifically talk about the price rising due to the demand rising, that the price goes up by a lot, and the value would then go up by a lot for exports. So your net exports would improve, and that would improve your trade balance. So if you're going to make that argument, you can't just leave it as they benefit from inelastic demand, because the inelastic demand would actually be very bad if the price was falling. So it needs a little bit more explanation than that. There was different arguments used. Like I said, some of us used like a scarcity argument in terms of why primary dependence is bad. Now, that scarcity argument and running out is an argument, but there are better economic arguments to use. So the Prebisch-Singer hypothesis is a higher level argument to use as you're using more economic theory to do that. If you talk about scarcity, you're probably going to end up more in application or low level marks, whereas if you talk about Prebisch-Singer hypothesis and declining terms of trade, which is likely to lead to, and the word likely is helpful here, balance of payment deficits. But that is in the long term. So even the case study talks about the negatives being in the longer term. So now they benefit from a higher oil price, and the reason for that is that the average price of exports, so the average price of oil, is less than the average price of imports. So if you are mostly selling oil, but you are buying back petrol, and some of us use that example, and it's a relevant example to use, good application marks, then over time, even bearing in mind the volumes, over time there will be a worsening of your balance. And at some point, your terms of trade, your poor terms of trade, will probably lead into a balance of payments deficit. The impact of that then is that reduction in the government budget position. So it's likely that the government budget will end up in a deficit. Your reserves will reduce over time because you'll be funding the greater imports with the reserves, and you also have that leakage from an economy which will probably start to increase unemployment. So all the benefits that you've got in the short term of the high oil price, in the longer term, it's likely that those will go. And using the Prebisch-Singer hypothesis and talking about the declining terms of trade and the worse balance of payments is a better way and will gain you more marks than just talking about scarcity and running out of a resource. Okay, the last big mark question linked to the case study was an evaluate question. So what we need there was two sides plus a judgment or an evaluative conclusion. The likely benefits for Russia of its decision to join the WTO. A nice technique that I've saw some students use is when we mentioned how you could rephrase that question, somebody crossed that out and just wrote free trade to help them remember that that was the key thing here. It mentions that kind of Russia is one of the last major economic powers to join the WTO. This tells you that the membership of that is that it's a big group. Now it does say it will force Russia to lower its tariffs. So there's still tariffs there. It's only going from 9.5 to 6, which is key. It's not getting rid of all tariffs, and probably more accurate, it's freer trade rather than just free trade by 2015. But what that also means is that the current members of the WTO will do the same for Russia. So some of us, in terms of accuracy, talked also about the WTO members reducing their tariffs. It's also talking about the removal of protectionist policies such as subsidies, specifically farming, but it's also looking at kind of the boost, or the economic boost from exports. It does mention some nice application here about the global economy not looking as favourable, so they may not benefit to the same extent as say China did. So that would be maybe a good argument to use in a conclusion about it depends on when you join. And it's also talking about they had a strong manufacturing base, so actually what they were selling were more value-added goods. And again, it depends on what your comparative advantage is, would be another very good way to evaluate. There are still, of course, potential benefits to Russia from WTO membership. They are hoping for foreign direct investment. So businesses that can see you joining the WTO know that there is the potential for an increase in exports, and that will make them more profit, so they may invest in your economy. It talks there about kind of some specific figures to use of the boost from more trade. So when you are applying, try and take these key figures from the case study. Then it repeats the bit about taking down protective barriers, and it's talking about people struggling to compete. So there you've got the very clear sunset industry argument. Okay. Again, some of us chose slightly different arguments to argue why free trade or freer trade was better, but the best arguments to use would be the comparative advantage argument. So you've got China currently in the WTO. So if we say this is China, and they've got manufactured goods, and Russia now join, and they are selling oil, and we have the starting position where both of them are producing a small combination of both goods, but then China specializes into manufacturing, Russia specializes into oil, and we end up with a lot more oil in total than we had originally, a lot more manufactured goods than we had originally, and the global production goes from somewhere around here to those maximums out there. Then there will be a specialism, or the countries will specialize in their lowest opportunity cost. That will mean that they will gain economies of scale, and they will create a surplus of goods domestically. This means that they will trade that surplus, and as the total global production has increased and the supply of goods has increased, what we should have is a lower price, which will increase utility, higher quality, which will increase utility, and a greater quantity of goods consumed, which will increase standards of living as well. So that argument for freer trade and specializing is again the more detailed, higher level argument to make, rather than just an increase in exports. So an increase in exports will get you some analysis marks, but that will take you into a high level of analysis. In terms of the reason against, you could, if it was a larger mark question, but potentially you might not have the time, you could reduce a tariff. So what you do have is the tariff reduces. It's going from world supply plus T back down to world supply. You've now got a reduction in the quantity that's bought domestically, and you have an increase in the quantity that's bought from global markets. So now we've gone from Q to Q1 domestically, but the global market now equals Q2, Q3. Now what you would talk about there is the negative, is that the job losses in the sunset industries, and more importantly structural unemployment, as people have lost those skills, which may have an opportunity cost to the government if there are unemployment benefits. Okay, in terms of it depends upon, a good way to link it back to comparative advantage is you can say it depends upon where your advantage is in terms of the sectors. Is it a primary advantage? Is it a secondary advantage? Or is it a high value added tertiary or service? Interestingly, the WTO agreements tend to focus more on these. So you tend to have to reduce tariffs and quotas here, but a lot of services aren't included in them. So to an extent, China benefited more because it's in the secondary, whereas Russia would benefit less because if they focus on that lower value added good and they trade with China, who's a higher value added good, then the Prebisch-Singer hypothesis would definitely happen. You could talk about it in terms of time, in that there still are tariffs, so there's still 6% tariffs because they haven't fully signed off the Doha agreement. So the level of free trade is not really free trade, it's just a reduction in protectionist barriers. So you could say it may, in the future, in the long term, if they do manage to sign off that agreement, then the tariffs would be even lower and then the benefits would be even greater through free trade. Okay, there was a choice in the last question, which was either between tradable permits and taxation in terms of reducing carbon emissions. Now, if you did this question, this is a micro question, and the reason you know it's a micro question is that reducing carbon emissions are a negative externality, and tradable permits are one of the solutions to negative externalities. If it says taxation, this is micro tax, so it's talking about indirect taxes to reduce consumption. So the graph that is relevant is either just a supply and demand graph showing that rise in price, or again, if you want the most accurate graph, you would draw a negative externality graph and you would add the tax to that, and that would take you to the socio-optimum quantity and the socio-optimum price. And then you've effectively talked about a higher level topic in terms of negative externalities and how you've solved it. If you were doing the tax, define an indirect tax. So it's a tax on spending on goods and services. If you talk about the effect of it, you need to mention that it increases cost of production. Don't forget your shift inwards in supply for accuracy. Then you talk about the price rising and the quantity falling. Okay. If it's tradable permits, there is a little bit more detail to that, and again you have to be very specific. One thing to be careful of is that tradable permits isn't about creating government revenue, but taxes do. So taxes can create government revenue, and that tends to be the intention of them as well, is to reduce consumption but to raise revenue. That's not the purpose of pollution permits, and any monies gained should be hypothecated across to people who need to, or who have invested in green technology. Coming to the graph, so you've got the demand for carbon, so the market is the carbon market, and over time you are going to reduce the supply until you get to the 1990 levels. So it might be that this is 2018's, it's probably going to be further in the future than that, but over time supply reduces. You're trying to gradually reduce the quantity until you get to the socio-optimum quantity, and the price rises to have two impacts. One of them is just to reduce demand in general for goods and services that pollute. One is to increase investment in green technology by the businesses that currently pollute. So for example, an airline would be a good application there. Or it's to encourage other businesses, so non-polluters, to invest in green technology. But what that is that's that key term, which is offsetting. So the businesses that invest in green technology but don't pollute, such as kind of wind farms, you get given permits. And then what you can do is sell those permits to the companies that need them, and then you're creating that hypothecation. So the people that pollute need them, but the rest of the economy and the businesses that can reduce it, reduce the pollution for them. What this is referred to is the people that do the reductions are the most efficient, or reductions in pollution happen at those businesses that have the lowest opportunity cost. A tax affects every business, but pollution permits treats businesses slightly differently. There's a choice there. So over time, we've got the fall in supply, we've got the increase in price, there's an incentive within that. There's also the quota aspect of this. So it acts as a quota to fix the amount of carbon emissions. One of the key weaknesses comes from that offsetting. So offsetting is global. Businesses in New Zealand could invest in a wind farm. They could be given permits. They bring those permits to the EU and they sell them in the EU or the European carbon trading market. So the demand comes from the EU, but the supply can be global. And even if we fix the quantity here in the EU, the quantity in the rest of the world is not fixed. So what that can mean is that even if you think you're reducing the supply of permits, the supply of permits can be greater. And then you end up with not the price up here, but the price down here. And that means that there is an incentive now to keep polluting or to invest in polluting technologies. So this did happen, that the price of carbon fell, and some countries within Europe have built coal-fired power stations because the cost to pollute was so low. That leads to a misallocation of resources. In terms of the weaknesses of the tax, some of us have already talked about inelastic demand, and that one's key. In terms of how you evaluate, what you need to do is choose one method or the other. The simplest method to choose would be to choose pollution permits and say, because it has aspects of a quota, because it has features of a tax in terms of the price rises, because it has features of a subsidy, because there is hypothecation in terms of the money going from those who pollute to those who invest in green technology, and that's done outside of the government, so there's no need for a tax and subsidy regime which may cost. People say this is more efficient, even more effective. However, at the moment, the weaknesses in the pollution permit system probably make a tax more effective. So in theory, the pollution permit scheme could be more effective, but there are things that aren't happening there, like controlling the quantity of permits globally. So you could say that on a national level, it may be more effective because those taxes could be implemented by each country. And regardless of economic conditions, they will always put the price up. Not many of us tried this last question, but I thought I'd go through it so you all had the chance to look at it. And when you look at the mark scheme, have a little look through this question anyway. This is probably a more straightforward question than the previous one, although less students attempted this one. The minimum wage graph, which we will come back to, is the same as a minimum price, but the minimum price is to reduce consumption. What a minimum wage is to do is to increase the wages of people, and to do things like reduce relative poverty, or to increase people's standards of living. Remember, the supply of workers is a supply line, and the demand from workers comes from businesses. So the original wage would be at this quantity, and the national minimum wage would increase it. If the national minimum wage works, then the market would be at Q1, there would be a higher wage, and there would now be an increase in the people that benefited from it. The evaluation comes from businesses not being able to make as much profit at that quantity. So actually they demand less workers at the higher wage, and what this causes is a level of unemployment. So the green part there, of this one, is the case for, or the positive impact of it. So the higher wage, higher standards of living, and more people benefiting from a higher wage. The negatives from the graph are the reduction in quantity demanded, and both of those are, it's an extension in supply and a contraction in demand, just for accuracy. Both of those combination of effects, so more people want jobs in that market because of the higher wage, but less businesses want to employ people, means that you have unemployment from Q to Q1. Now this can also be thought of as a government failure, because people will stay in this market when they should be going to a different market to work, because they see the national minimum wage and they think, I want to get that wage, but there's just not enough jobs available at that higher wage. That's the theory of both sides. In terms of the evaluation, it really depends on where the minimum wage starts. So there's a lot of argument that actually minimum wage rises over the last 10 years haven't led to any effects on employment. So unemployment hasn't changed as the minimum wage rises. What that would suggest is that before we had the minimum wage, that there was an extent of monopoly power in markets, and that was driving wages down. So you could argue that because there are the businesses had more power, that actually the wages were lower than the social optimum level. So actually raising the wage is just solving a market failure. You could argue that it depends upon other costs of production to a business. So wages are only one cost, but raw materials are another, corporation tax and other business taxes are another, energy costs and so on. So if wages are the only thing that's going up, and this may be really more important if you are, say, a capital intensive business and your other costs aren't, or they may even be reducing, then actually you can afford the minimum wage and the impact may not be great. Currently, because of Brexit, raw material prices are going up and the effect on the weakening of the currency, the government has been increasing tax rates for business, and then you add in wages, and some people are now saying that some of the businesses in the UK that are currently failing is because of those higher costs through things like the minimum wage. Okay, so what you're going to do now is open up your envelopes, look inside there, there will be a mark scheme and some instructions specific to you for what you need to do. So have a look at that, and there may be some extra instructions on your work, but between the highlighted things and what's on your work and the mark scheme, you need to take some paper and make the improvements. So what's written down, just do it. Once you've done that, put all of that back into your folder, and that's going to be handed back in, and then I will remark it, and next week we'll start on one-to-ones and we'll look at kind of our progress so far. Once you've made your improvements, there's a few extra things you can do. There are 2 example A grade answers from last summer's paper 1. Before you read them though, look at the question, plan it yourself first on a bit of scrap of a paper, how would you answer it, and then read through the example answer and see how similar it is to yours, and is there anything else you've missed. If you've done all of that, then there's a stack of economic reviews at the front. Borrow one of those, have a little read of one of the articles. If you've done that, go back to your formal assessment book and look at formal assessment 1, 2 and 3. Review what you did well and what you improved on those. And last but not least, for those of you that are staying for Guru Alex's revision session, I've left some exam questions you can go through with him. If you are confident that you've got the right answers, that's fine. If you aren't, if one of you logs into Facebook and goes to the group, I will be on Facebook, so you can message me. And if there's any specific questions, I'll respond to it, because I'll probably be on a train back from Leeds when you are doing that revision session. Chris will swap over with another member of staff. They'll just keep an eye on you in the room, and then you can revise to your heart's content. Have a good weekend. Do the essay question on Moodle, and I will see you on Monday.